Hello, greetings from Whiston Estate Winery. This is Dermot and Alex, winemaker and sales director of Whiston Estate, on International Chardonnay Day, which is, was a nice surprise. We didn't quite expect that when we actually scheduled this a few weeks ago, but today is International Chardonnay Day.
Which is a wonderful surprise. So that's good. So it means we can celebrate that in its own right. So, which actually, we should probably explain why that's a good thing, given we're talking about Blanc de Blanc. Okay,
so this is the second in our Spotlight On tasting series. A couple of weeks ago, we did Spotlight on our vintage cuvée and our non-vintage cuvée. So continuing the theme of comparing and contrasting our non-vintage wines with our vintage wines, we're looking at our non-vintage Blanc de Blanc and the vintage Blanc de Blanc. And we'll be tasting through these wines tonight, answering through a number of questions that have been pre-served to us, and indeed, you know, any questions that are coming through, we'll be delighted to answer and talk about.
Cool. Why don't we actually start with Blanc de Blanc is a huge thing for both of us.
Yeah.
It's a wine that both of us love dearly. I have my story, but why don't we start with your story as to why Blanc de Blanc is one of your favourite wines to make?
Okay. Well, what is Blanc de Blanc, first and foremost, is probably a good place to start. Blanc de Blanc is, well, in my experience, only ever really used to describe a sparkling wine rather than a still wine. But it's a sparkling wine which is first and foremost a white sparkling wine made out of exclusively white grapes. Now, the most typical exponent or example of that is a white sparkling wine made out of Chardonnay, because that's probably the most typical white variety that sparkling wines are made out of. But it could indeed be a white sparkling wine made out of any white variety, such as Pinot Blanc or Gruner Veltliner or, I don't know, any other white varietal. But what is probably most popular and what will spring to people's minds immediately is Chardonnay. Yeah. And that's really because of the classic Champagne Blanc de Blanc, which I think started to become famous for probably only about, 20, 30 years ago, because it wasn't really a thing in Champagne before that.
You know more about this than I do, I must say, because you have your experience of being in Champagne, and so it has become, I suppose, almost like a brand in itself, Blanc de Blanc, or even Blanc de Noir if it's with the black grapes.
Yeah.
It's something that is particularly brilliant for here in the UK. It's the soil type, the everything. But I mean, why did you end up by making Blanc de Blanc in particular? What was?
Well, I think I fell in love with the style of Blanc de Blanc initially, really when I was working at Night Timber, because Blanc de Blanc was a very, very important part of the Night Timber story. And the first Night Timber wine, which really hit the world stage, I didn't make it. It was a lot earlier, before my time there. The 1992, the first one at Night Timber was a Blanc de Blanc. That's the very first one that was released in 1996, and that was, served and admired all over the world. So that was very, very special, and that was my introduction really to English Blanc de Blanc and English Chardonnay. Kind of further down my journey into sparkling wine and Champagne. I used to go to Champagne an awful lot back then, 15 years ago and whatever. Less so now, but I still really enjoy going there. In fact, I can't wait to go again once I get released from North Farm. But my kind of journey into Champagne really focused on the wines of the Côte du Blanc in the south of Champagne, where they grow almost exclusively Chardonnay to make Blanc de Blanc in the Côte de Blanc, in the White Hills, if you like, of the south of Champagne. And those are the wines that really, really communicated with me a great deal, because of the energy, the drive, the vivacity of those wines, and we'll come on to this, why I think Chardonnay is wonderful in England, but. That's my story about how I found and love Blanc de Blanc. And yours, Alex?
So mine my reason why I'm a Whiston is purely because of the Blanc de Blanc. Before I knew virtually anything about English sparkling wine years ago, I'd gone for dinner at Chiltern Firehouse in London, and we were served on arrival a glass of sparkling wine. Weren't told where it was from in the world.
Really? Okay.
Just literally, it was quite a busy evening. It was a Saturday night. The head sommelier Roman put down the glasses, and then whisked off somewhere else. It was a lovely, lovely treat. And my husband and I took a sip of this wine and thought, flipping hell, where is this from? This is amazing. Yeah. And when he came back, he said it was English. And it was like, oh wow, that's amazing. Where in England is it from? And he said it's from West Sussex, which, although I was living in London at the time, I actually grew up in West Sussex. Yeah. And so drilling down further, asked where in West Sussex it was from. And he then said it was from Whiston, which is 15 minutes away from where I grew up, and where my parents still live.
In Partridge Green, just down the A24.
And so, as a result, I became obsessed.
Really?
The Blanc de Blanc non-vintage, which is what it was, I fell in love.
So what year would this have been, Alex?
It was 2016.
16, okay.
Yeah. So it was March 2016.
Yeah.
And at that point in time in London, it was actually really hard to get hold of English sparkling wine.
Okay.
So it was really, really difficult. So, and especially quality English sparkling wine. And so it was quite an oddity. And I became obsessed. I sort of, in a really slightly embarrassing way, started trying to get hold of as much Whiston as I could. Yeah. Just off this one wine. Yeah. And when we moved from London to Sussex, a year later, I stalked the Goring family and forced them to give me a job purely because of this wine. Yeah. So I'm very excited to be drinking again this evening. So it's
that's a good story, and I'm trying to work out. That wine must have been that non-vintage Blanc de Blanc. I'm trying to work out, was that the first one we released? And I think it was, and it was based on the 2011. Okay. It had a little bit of reserve wine from 2009, if I remember correctly. But that was our first Whiston non-vintage Blanc de Blanc. And it was great because it was based on 2011, and 2011 fruit was absolutely amazing. But it's funny, actually, I remember when we got that listing with Chiltern Firehouse, which is, an extraordinary place. And I was very, very excited about getting that listing, and they asked me to come up and do a tasting with the sommelier's team, with the front of house team and the service staff. And I actually did it on the very, very last day of the 2014 harvest here at Whiston, which was the biggest harvest we'd ever done by some margin in 2014, which was a huge, huge harvest. And I remember there was 3 weeks of just absolute mayhem, 16, 18 hours a day for 21 days non-stop. And on the final day, after we'd emptied loaded the final press, or maybe halfway through the final press was loaded and it was started, and we all took selfies, the big team of us took selfies in front of the Pera press. And then I went home and I went up to London and I did this presentation to the guys, feeling a kind of a mixture of exhaustion, exasperation, and just pure delight that that wine had got a listing at an absolutely top place.
Top place.
Yeah.
So that probably leads us on to why does Chardonnay do so well in England? Because actually part of the reason why we realised it was International Chardonnay Day today is because Decanter magazine put out an article yesterday evening about their top Chardonnays that had been in the Decanter World Wine Awards last year. And they in particular chose our vintage Blanc de Blanc because it won, along with two other Chardonnays from England, Best in Show, two from Chapel Down. And Best in Show is a particularly prestigious award. It was sort of the top, given to only the top 50 wines out of over 16,500 wines tasted. Mm-hmm. And it's quite an amazing thing for three English 100% Chardonnay wines to be in that globally against red, white, rosé, fortified, all styles. Why do you think Chardonnay is so
So it's a good question. It's a curious phenomena, I think, really, that Chardonnay does so well in England. Is it exclusively to do with chalk soils? I don't think so. I think chalk soils help, but there's lots of examples of very, very good English Blanc Blancs which are grown on heavier, darker soils, more clay, sandy soils, green sand soils and clay soils. So it must be to do with the grape variety itself, which of course is like a chameleon throughout the world, the way that Chardonnay adapts to different terroirs and different climates all around the world, from making, piercing, brilliant, limpid, sparkling wines in cool climates like in Northern Europe and here in England, to making, fat, heavy, rich, blockbuster white wines in California, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and then absolutely everything in between. So it's an amazing, grape variety that is capable of being sculpted in all sorts of different ways to produce different wines. And I think it just kind of sings here in England in a very, very cool climate, and produces wines of extraordinary finesse and length, and given time in bottle, real detail and development. It loves it, and I think a lot of the winemakers in the UK, once they realise just what Chardonnay can do, because I think it takes time. They're not wines that show themselves immediately when they're young. Mm-hmm. They can actually be quite austere and challenging, sparkling wines when they're in their youth. But I think once you have the opportunity and you've got the privilege of maybe aging them for a while in the cellar and disgorging them at different times and seeing how they actually develop, then it's a really rewarding grape variety to work with.
And what about, although you were saying it doesn't necessarily need to be chalk in particular, where we are on the South Downs, our 6.5 hectare vineyard is planted to pure chalk. Basically, there's like minute amount of soil, and then it's just solid white. In fact, like the solid, humongous bit of white that we have here. Here's one I made earlier. Yeah. It's balancing that so I don't knock over the table.
Everything on the carefully balanced table.
Why do you think, why did we choose our site back in 2006? Why was that the perfect site for you for the vineyard?
Well, one of the first things I got really excited about when I met Harry and Pip Goring, on talking to them about the land that they owned here at Whiston Estate, was the fact that they told me 2/3 of the rather large estate was based on South Downs chalk. So I thought, right, well, that's pretty interesting. And then they told me they wanted to plant a vineyard, and I thought that's even more interesting. Let's go have a look at this place. So from tasting wines in Champagne, I realised that chalk was producing extraordinary wines, and I had no experience other than Breaky Bottom. Actually, other than tasting the wines of Peter Hall at Breaky Bottom, where he was growing Saval Blanc and Chardonnay and Pinot Noir on chalk. I didn't actually know of any other vineyards in the south of England who were making sparkling wine on chalk vineyards, and I thought that would be a really interesting development for us to do, and personally that I wanted to do. And then when I came and had a look at the land, I thought, wow, this is absolutely fantastic. Let's go for this. Yeah. It was a kind of an experiment that had a very limited potential to fail, I think. By combining, chalk vineyard with Chardonnay, Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, but particularly the Chardonnay aspect of it. There's a marriage made in Sussex.
And the Chardonnay for us with the plantings, it makes up 55% of the vineyard. But within that, it's not as simple as just saying it's Chardonnay. There's lots of different types of Chardonnay within.
There are, yeah. There's all sorts of arguments for and against this. We planted a lot of different clones. Right throughout the vineyard.
When you say clones, what do you mean by clones?
Okay, so within Chardonnay plants, Chardonnay variety, you've got different varieties. Not varieties. It's all one variety, but different breeds of Chardonnay, shall we say, which have got different characteristics that have been bred over the years, isolated from different vineyards and bred over the years. And some of them will favour high maturity, high ripeness, and low yields. Those are typically ones that are used to make white wines throughout the world. We call them sometimes Dijon clones. So they'll make white Burgundies, and they'll be used in places in warmer climates throughout the world. And then you've got other clones which are designed to actually have bigger yield, have lower maturity but higher acidity, and so these ones are more attuned to making sparkling wines, let's say. So we've got a broad range of different clones that'll ripen at different times. They'll ripen to different levels of sugar maturity, have different levels of acidity, different pH and things like this. So that's been really interesting over the years to kind of learn what kind of tune the orchestra, if you want to compare that part of the vineyard to an orchestra, what kind of tunes each of those instruments are playing. And I think we've got something like 8 different clonal selections on different rootstocks in that latter part of the vineyard. And it became pretty clear early on what the best sequence to pick those grapes was at harvest time. And then over the years, which of those clones were producing the best Chardonnay, the best barrels of wine. And that's been really, really interesting. And, it's funny because, without getting too outrageously technical, the rootstock surprised us that, it's SO4 and not one of the more chalk-resistant ones that is producing the fantastic quality. But it's also the steepest part of the slope. So maybe the clone doesn't matter that much. Maybe it's actually the steepness of that part of the vineyard which is just producing the best fruit.
So it is, I suppose in that sense, it is the terroir that is...
It's such a complicated thing. Terroir is everything, isn't it? Terroir is not just the soil. It's the aspect, it's the plant, it's the microorganisms around those plants in that part of the vineyard. Yeah, it's been fascinating. And the vineyard is now 15 years ago it was planted in 2006, so we're probably in year 15. In year 15, and we're still learning about that vineyard. It's really, really interesting
because each year is so different. But we should probably taste the first wine.
Yeah. So Blanc non-vintage. So just to kind of recap on the vintage non-vintage strategy or policy or story here at Whiston Estate is the vintage is all from just the Whiston Estate vineyard, single vineyard, and single vintage 2015. That's the second wine we're going to be tasting. We'll come on to that in a moment. But the non-vintage style of wine that we make here is first and foremost a blend of different years. So here we're actually based on the 2015 vintage as well, but there's reserve wine coming from older years. And we've got some 2009 and some 2013 in this wine. But also we're not just using Chardonnay, which is coming from the Whiston vineyard. We're also using some Chardonnay which are coming from neighbouring partner vineyards of ours, all very, very local here on the South Downs. So we're getting quite a different spread of different fruit coming in to make this wine, which makes it very, very interesting indeed. It's the goal of this wine is to make a wine which is as approachable early on in its life as possible, really, and the addition of reserve wine, older wine, promotes that maturity or a sense of maturity early on in the life of the wine, and to make something which is just absolutely delicious to drink,
I love this wine.
at any time.
So, I mean, part of the reason why this is a particularly special getting to taste this is this is one of our very last bottles, basically, of this wine.
Yeah.
Although technically with non-vintage wines, arguably people consider, you sort of think about making it every year. It's one of those ones you sort of make it in large quantities. For us, this isn't something that we do. And this wine, we are sadly coming to the end of the 2015 release. Because of the yields, in 16 and 17.
Very, very small. Yeah.
So when you're deciding between the years when we make it and when we don't, how do you make that decision?
It's really guided by the requirements to give Chardonnay to other wines, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we make a Brut non vintage, which is about a third of Chardonnay. Yeah. That takes quite a lot of that Chardonnay. When we're making a vintage wine for the Wisdom vintage Blanc, then that's going to take necessarily the very best of that fruit. And you know, in those years, 15 was a small year as well, but 16 and 17 were much, much smaller. And I'd love to be able to make this wine every year, but it's just not possible. Yeah. It's just not possible. Thankfully, in 2018, we had quite a good amount of Chardonnay. So there's a wonderful kind of follow-up to this Blanc non-vintage, which will be based on 18. And actually in the cellar at the moment, I've got a very, very good quantity of the 19 version.
Which is delicious.
It is, yeah. It's tasting very, very well. And again, it's a wine composed of different component parts. And this is a really interesting thing to do. And we'll contrast that with the vintage in a moment. But, you know, this wine, the non-vintage, is composed of, you know, there's two different types of reserve wine here. There's 2009, which is really quite old. There's some 2000 just a bit, exactly. God, yeah, it's exactly 2000 and what's that?
11 years
old. A little bit of the 2013, and then the rest of it is coming from that 15 vintage. So it's got a lot of interesting component parts. There's some wood in there. There's some oak aging in there, but most of it is stainless steel. And then, you know, we're using a variety of different techniques on these different components, such as doing some malolactic to soften the acidity on some parts of it, and then deliberately not doing the malolactic, so we're retaining freshness in other components of the wine, putting them all together and hoping for the best.
But yeah, it is. I mean, yeah, it is an awesome wine. It's going to be sad to have the break, but granted, it'll be even more exciting when the 2018.
Yeah, it's been a victim of its own success, really, because, you know, the price point that we can offer this wine at, which is, you know, a fantastic retail price of, I don't know, 27, 20, okay, yeah. Is great value for a wine which is just so eminently drinkable and versatile. Mm-hmm. It's it's wonderful, but we will have some magnums of this, don't we? I think there are some magnums of the 15 based non-vintage Blanc, which are still creeping around the dark parts of the cellar, the back of North Farm here.
One thing I find quite interesting is we are, as Weston, we're one of the few people who make a Blanc non-vintage. Why do you think that is in particular?
I don't know. I think it's probably to do with me, because I was so keen to just try and make as many different styles of Chardonnay as possible. I think it's a great style to experiment with. You know, it's monovarietal. You're just using that, so you know the wine will stay on that style of Chardonnay, which is, you know, very kind of direct and slender and pointed. Quite austere in its youth, but you can build a lot of complexity into it and then just watch that wine develop over time. You're not bringing in different influences like Pinot Noir, which will give a different structure and a different weight and kind of a different fruit dimension to the wine, or you're not using Pinot Meunier, which is, you know, something very, very kind of fresh and fruity and more confectionery-like. You're keeping the wine on one kind of path, and I guess because I'm a Chardonnay lover, I love that part of it. And also because of the nature of what we do here at Wiston Estate, which isn't just making wine for ourselves, but we also make wine for contract clients. And therefore we've got access to some of that fruit from these other vineyards. And we know them really well because, you know, I've been making those wines from these other vineyards for years now, you know, for well over a decade. So we know the quality of those vineyards and therefore what that fruit will do. So why other people do it, I'm not really terribly sure. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of it in the future, you know, because we know that lots and lots of Chardonnay has been planted, lots of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay has been planted, probably less Pinot Meunier, and hopefully that will rise as well. But I think there's great potential to work with Blanc non-vintage blends in the future.
Should we try the vintage, since we've talked probably for an awful lot more about the Blanc non-vintage?
Okay, all right, very good. Yeah, it's great. There's a lovely sense of freshness in that wine. It's so accessible. It's so immediately delicious.
Yeah.
And now the vintage. We're on 2015 vintage here. It's only been released pretty much from the start of this year.
Yeah,
is
we
that
released
right?
it in January.
In January, okay. Following on from a long break from the previous vintage Blanc, which was in 2011. So we've actually made the Blanc vintage. So again, only coming from 1 year, only coming from the Western States single vineyard. We've made it in 2009. We've made it in 2010. We made it in 2011. There was no 12. There was no 13. There was no 14. And then we jump on to 2015. So the 2010 was an absolutely awesome wine. Probably one of, maybe my favourite. Certainly was at the time, or for many years my favourite. 2011 vintage Blanc from Whistling then came out and just pretty much broke records left, right and centre. That what you were talking about earlier, the decanter 2018, it was given 98 points.
Decanter 2019.
2019? Yeah. Okay.
So they tasted 16,800 wines from around the world across all types of styles, and the top mark they gave throughout the whole competition was 98 points out of 100, which they gave to only 6 wines globally, all styles. And our Blanc 2011 was one of those wines, so it's pretty awesome.
Amazing. Yeah, it is amazing. But 2011 was an extraordinary year. Super warm conditions at harvest. Very, very small harvest because it was terrible weather in the middle of the year around flowering. So a tiny fruit set and a tiny amount of fruit. And once that's limited earlier on in the year, the vineyard doesn't produce any more fruit. What you've got is what you've got, and then it's about how you ripen it. And September 2011 was remarkably warm, the warmest temperatures ever recorded actually in the UK in September. So it made unbelievably luscious wine. But what was really surprising was that a wine that was so ripe still aged so brilliantly well, But yeah, it's remarkable to get a score like that, and that shows what Chardonnay can do in England in a spectacularly warm year. But what I'm really happy about, and I didn't really know this at the time because, when we were making this 2015 Chardonnay, the 2011 wasn't even released back then, But this is actually stylistically really similar to the 2011 and dissimilar to the 10 and the 2009, which is actually still in the cellar. That's another story. That's a story for another time. But this 2015 is following on in the footsteps of the 11 because it's clearly ripe, but it's luscious and it's rich. It's a very voluptuous and deep and broad a Blanc.
I love this wine. It's got a really lovely, like a tangerine note to it. There's a slight citrus, but it's a richer citrus. But you've still got that glorious underlying sort of crushed oyster shell, the sort of the minerality that you want that expresses the fact that it comes from all this chalk. I think it's going to be an amazing wine. Okay, so what we were 5 years after vintage, 2015. We're drinking this in 2020. I think the way the wine is appears to be really quite advanced. The acidity is still like electricity in the wine, still really fresh. But the sense of autolysis and the yeast notes that are infused with all of that fruit and the complexity, I'm quite surprised actually. It seems to be almost more advanced than the 2011 was after 5 years. So it's great. The wine has spent, or half of the wine, generally about 50% of this was put in old barrels. And I think you get a sense of that in the texture of the wine, but not necessarily actually in the
in the taste profile. There aren't any oaky notes, or at least what do you get a kind of an oak sensation in the wine?
It's just that it is richer in style than the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage. It's rounder. Where I always end up waving my hands around when I try to describe wine, but when with the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage, it's a much more focused style, whereas this has a rounder voluptuousness to it, but there's still got that backbone that kind of gives it elegance and poise.
It'll be really interesting to see how long this will live, because I think it's got another 10 years in it at this stage. I would say it's that wonderful contradiction that I think you get in English sparkling wines, and maybe actually particularly you get it in Blanc de Blanc. Maybe, that you get this contradiction of the wines being absolutely delicious and ready to drink now, albeit super fresh, but also with this fantastic possibility or potential to age and go for a long, long time. And I think that's actually that's unusual in a lot of wine-making regions around the world, to have these two things almost side by side. Either that, or I'm a complete acid freak. And I love this. But I'll tell you, there was something interesting just the other day. I know that there was a sparkling wine tasting, and the tasting. There was one English sparkling wine in the tasting among some very illustrious champagnes, and then some other sparkling wines from around the world. And people who tasted it was actually Whiston Blanc de Blanc 2010 that was in the tasting. When they tasted all these champagnes and other sparkling wines from warmer climates, and then came across the Whiston 2010, all of them were like, whoa, the acidity, it's just absolutely crazy. This is such a different sparkling wine. It was such a contrast to the other wines there. And then when people came back and tasted the wines again, it was the Whiston with that outrageous acidity compared to the other sparkling wines that people just liked more and more. It seemed to develop more and more in the glass than all the other wines. And this is, I think, testament to the freshness and the charge of energy that's naturally in English sparkling wines. I'm an addict.
So there's a couple of questions that we've got. So Karen Krisnanovich, who sort of asked what the hallmarks are of a great Blanc de Blanc, which kind of flows on from...
Yeah, I think it's that, white, yellow fruit, white flowers, a sense of minerality, a sense of terroir, whether it's going to be chalk or otherwise, because Chardonnay is very, very good kind of prism of to show minerality and the soil where it's coming from. I think that kind of austerity in youth, that kind of edginess and challenging nature in its youth, when the wine is generally quite tight. I like the wines when they're like that, because you can kind of anticipate how they're going to mature and develop. But then as they develop, they gain in weight, they put on a little bit of fat, and they increase in their depth, but they remain as a kind of singular in direction. That for me is what I like about Chardonnay, and I think is pretty typical about it.
And what makes a vintage year for us for Blanc de Blanc?
Well, good weather is the first thing. Absolutely good weather. It doesn't really matter if it's a small harvest like the 2011 has proven, or if it's a big harvest like the 2018 has proven. You went from a tiny harvest to a very, very big harvest, and you still can have really elevated levels of ripeness in the wines. What makes a great year? I guess it is. It's we decide, not whilst we're picking the grapes, if we're going to be making vintage wines, we decide over the next 3 or 4 or 5 months when if we're going to be making absolutely whether we want to keep our Chardonnay from Whiston Estates separate, or indeed we want to build in some other wines from other vineyards. So really, it only it reveals itself generally the year after the vintage.
And when we harvest each clone separately?
To an extent, usually we'll group together clones that ripen at the same time.
Okay.
So you've got to be kind of practical about it, and we know the pattern now from 2008, 2009, the very first vintages. We know now what pattern of the vineyard that we're going to pick in, and I tend to follow that now because it was, it proved to be consistent over the first 4 or 5 years of the vineyard. So we kind of know that's going to happen.
And then we'll vinify those, and that will be. Then you'll make the decision off the back of that. Those patches.
Yeah, absolutely. So we put all of the Whiston fruit goes into the Coquard press. The fruit which is coming from other vineyards sometimes goes in the Coquard, but other times will go into the other presses that we've got.
The Coquards are unique, special.
The Coquard is our baby, is our labour of love. It's pretty unique. It's the only traditional Coquard basket press that's in the UK. I think it was behind me, wasn't it, when we did this video a couple of weeks ago? Generally, the fruit that's coming out of that will almost always go into barrel. So it'll be collected in a stainless steel tank, start the fermentation, and then that wine will go into barrel. And that'll if we're making a vintage wine that year, that wine that's in barrel will be the core of that. But then the other Chardonnay coming from there will go into stainless steel. And I like to have that balance, of wine in barrel, which is giving that kind of richer texture and smoothness, and a retention of acidity compared to then the wine which is in stainless steel, which we can soften a little bit. And then it's about finding a kind of a biting point between the two to get a good blend.
So we've got another question is saying, how do you think we are or can differentiate from champagne? That's from Ferrovinum.
Oh, that's a bit of a disaster.
That is our fire alarm going
okay.
off.
I think it's time to...
I'm just going to mute that for a second.
So there we go. And so Dermot's just rushing back. There we go. That's fine. The joys of life.
Remarkably, a false alarm.
So we got from Ferrovinum before that came off. How do you think we are or can differentiate from champagne?
Okay, so I was thinking about this earlier, and it's almost I find this question almost more difficult to answer every year. Earlier on in my career, I used to always say, look, English sparkling wine is completely different to champagne. Of course it is. We're a different country. Okay, we're copying what they've been doing for centuries, but it's a completely different wine. It is and it isn't. At the end of the day, and I think our industry in England is mature enough now to be able to, even though we're still babies, we're mature enough to say, yes, we're going to be compared to champagne all the time. It's the inevitable comparison, and it's been happening for years now. I think every wine professional throughout the world has become, totally clued up to the fact if somebody sticks a champagne-like wine in front of their nose and says, where do you think this comes from? Most of the time it's been, it's from England. Who would have guessed? But actually everybody's kind of guessing that now, especially once they, taste the signature style, which is that kind of freshness on the nose, very, very delineated, detailed flavors on the nose, and of course this acidity, this lifted, enhanced acidity, which you don't really see in many other sparkling wines from around the world. So, we'll always be compared to champagne, and thankfully that's getting more and more favourable all the time. Mm-hmm. We are England, we are different, but we deserve to be where we are in terms of being constantly compared to champagne.
Now, Pete, I was just checking my phone, but it turns out the questions aren't coming through onto my phone. Are we okay for anything? Perfect. That's all good.
Prepared for all emergencies.
Prepared for all emergencies. So, I think the only other thing I just wanted to ask was about how how basically the wines have evolved since we released them. So for both of them, both the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage and also the Blanc de Blanc vintage, if there's anything in particular you would say has changed. I mean, I know you talked about earlier with the Blanc de Blanc 10 is quite different, you feel, to the 15.
Yeah, I think that was... I wonder why that was. Actually, I can tell you why that... Can I tell you why that was? I think 2010 was actually a very stylistically different year because those wines were very, very lean, and we actually released them quite young, so they hadn't put on a bit of fat, like I was saying earlier on. They were very, very lean. We disgorged them very lean because those are the first Blanc de Blanc that we released, and I remember that was a really good example of a vintage where the wines went on to mature beautifully. 10 years after vintage, they still taste fantastic. But even once they had something like 2 years on lees, you know, and they were disgorged at only, I remember the first examples we did were just like 4 grams per litre, 2 years on lees, and those wines tasted absolutely fantastic. So they were always of that kind of, they tasted great when they're very, very lean. The 11 and now this 15 are in this more weighty kind of developed plump style, and I like that very much. But you know, the very first wine that we made, which is yet to be released, and it's an amazing, extraordinary thing, the 2009. You know, I right from the start, I thought let's go for generally half the wine in barrel and half the wine in stainless steel, and that's the one thing that really has stayed. You know, it's generally in some years, like the 2011, it was slightly less of the oak. It was only 40% and 60% of stainless steel. But I've kind of kept to that philosophy, really. It's quite a simple kind of recipe-driven philosophy, you could even say. But, you know, have around half of it in oak, half of it in stainless steel. And it tends to work very, very well indeed.
Perfect. Well, I think we're kind of pretty much done, I think. Before we go, we should say a shout out to David Irwin.
Oh yes, David. Yes, I was wondering, David, was it you who was playing left back for Manchester United throughout the 1990s? But I think that's your cousin Dennis Irwin. But David, thank you so much indeed. You've been an amazing supporter, and I meant to give you a shout out a couple of weeks ago when we were doing the Cuvée vintage non-vintage tasting. But hello to you in Northern Ireland, pal.
Perfect. And so other than that, I think we can wrap up.
Yeah.
But thank you everyone for joining us. And we will be hopefully doing a rosé comparison for the next tasting.
Absolutely, yeah.
Of our rosé non-vintage and our rosé vintage.
Yeah, date to be announced. Hope you liked the deliberate fire emergency drill that we performed. The muster station was outside, gathered all the crew.
And if you'd like to follow for the next tasting, then if you subscribe to our mailing list on our website, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. But yes,
fantastic.
Happy International Chardonnay Day.
Indeed, absolutely. Hope those of you who are tasting well at home enjoy the wines, and see you again. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.